Muditā, joy. For several episodes now, we have been examining the qualities of a trained mind. We began with goodwill, mettā, the simple, deliberate wish for beings to be happy. Then, equanimity, upekkha, the ground that does not drown in what it meets. Then, compassion, karuṇā, the warmth that moves towards suffering without being consumed by it. There is a fourth Brahmavihārā. It has not appeared yet in this catalog. Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, in an evening talk at Mettā Forest Monastery, described it this way: of the different Brahmavihārās, this is the poor stepsister, the one who doesn't get much press. Tonight, Muditā, the one that gets overlooked, the one that turns out to be, by many accounts, the most demanding of the four. Most people can feel happy when someone they love succeeds. The feeling is warm, easy, natural. A friend gets a promotion, a child graduates, a partner achieves something they have been working toward for years. You feel glad, of course you do. The Buddhist tradition noticed that this tells you almost nothing about whether you have actually developed muditā, appreciative joy. The real test is different. The test of muditā is not how you feel when someone you love succeeds. It is how you feel when someone you don't particularly like succeeds at something you wanted. A colleague receives the recognition you worked for. A peer achieves the thing you were hoping to achieve. Someone younger surpasses what you spent a lifetime building. What happens in that moment? Not what you think should happen, not what you tell yourself later. What actually happens in the body, in the breath, in the first half second before the story begins. Most people have a word for it. The Pali Canon has a word for the opposite. And the opposite, it turns out, is much harder to develop than the warm, easy feeling you get when someone you already love does well. That is what this episode is about. Not sentimental happiness, not the cheerful excitement that comes and goes with conditions. Something more precise, more stable, and more difficult. The capacity to genuinely delight in another's well-being, any others, without the grasping that turns it into excitement, and without the resentment that turns it into something darker. By the end, you will know exactly what muditā is in the canon's own language, how it relates to the other three Brahmavihārās, where it fails, in two very different ways that most people never distinguish, and what the practice actually looks like when the person whose success you are meeting is not someone you find easy to celebrate. Chapter 1. What muditā is. Let us start with what muditā actually is, according to the person whose framing has anchored this entire Brahmavihārā series. Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, in his essay collection, Head and Heart Together, synthesizes the relationship between the four Brahmavihārās this way. Empathetic joy is what goodwill feels when it encounters happiness. It wants the happiness to continue. Stay with that for a moment. Muditā is not a separate quality imported from somewhere else. It is not an add-on. It is what happens when goodwill, the wish for beings to be happy, meets a situation where beings actually are happy. Goodwill does not stop at that point and say, "My work here is done." It responds. It sees the happiness, and it wants that happiness to continue. Not because the feeling of witnessing happiness is pleasant, though it often is. Because the original wish was for beings to be happy, and here they are, happy. The wish and the reality have met. Muditā is the quality of that meeting. Compassion works the same way in the other direction. Goodwill meets suffering and becomes compassion. The wish for the suffering to stop. Goodwill meets happiness and becomes muditā. The wish for the happiness to continue. Same root, different conditions, different faces of the same orientation. Now, a disclosure. because precision matters. That sentence. Empathetic joy is what goodwill feels when it encounters happiness. It wants the happiness to continue, is Ṭhānissaro's synthesis. It is not a verbatim quote from the Pali Canon. It is his formulation of how the Brahmavihārās relate to each other causally, how one generates the other depending on what the mind encounters. It is pedagogically clear. It is consistent with what the suttas describe. But it is his framing, and you should know that. Throughout this episode, as in the previous 3, we will mark the difference between what the canon says, what the commentaries add, and what a particular teacher synthesizes. These are 3 different kinds of authority. All 3 are valuable. They are not the same. What the canon itself gives us is different in form and remarkable in scope. The canonical formula for mudita appears across multiple suttas: AN 10, 196, DN 13, MN 7, MN 99, SN 42, 8, in virtually identical language each time. Ṭhānissaro's translation from AN 10, 196. That disciple of the noble ones, thus devoid of covetousness, devoid of ill will, unbewildered, alert, mindful, keeps pervading the first direction with an awareness imbued with empathetic joy. Likewise the second, likewise the third, likewise the fourth. Thus above, below, and all around, everywhere. In its entirety, he keeps pervading the all-encompassing cosmos with an awareness imbued with empathetic joy, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will. AN 10, 196. 5 qualifiers, the same 5 that appear for mettā, karuṇā, and upekkha, word for word: abundant, expansive, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will, and the same directional structure: east, south, west, north, above, below, all around. The conch trumpet simile from DN 13 captures the spirit. Just as a strong conch trumpet blower can notify the 4 directions without any difficulty, so too does the practitioner pervade the world with this quality, DN 13. No boundary. No selection, not a curated list of people whose happiness is easy to welcome. The cosmos. Notice what is absent from the formula. There is no list of appropriate recipients. There is no clause that exempts the difficult case. The formula does not say abundant, expansive, immeasurable, except for the colleague who received the promotion you wanted. It does not say without hostility, unless their success makes yours look smaller. It says the all-encompassing cosmos. All beings in its entirety. That is the target. The practice, as we will see in Chapter 3, begins closer to home. But the target is immeasurable. Apamana in Pali. Keep that word. It will matter when we examine why this quality is so difficult to extend beyond the people you already like. The sequence. Now, the sequence. Why does mudita come third, not first, not last? The ordering is canonical across every major sutta that lists the Brahmavihārās. AN 10:196, MN 7, MN 21, DN 13, SN 46:54, SN 42:8. The sequence is consistent. Mettā first, karuṇā second, mudita third, upekkha fourth. This is not an arbitrary arrangement. Ṭhānissaro's causal reading of this ordering, and this again is his synthesis, not a canonical formula, gives the sequence an internal logic that is worth understanding. Mettā is the foundation, the wish for beings to be happy. Karuṇā is what that wish becomes when it meets suffering. You want the suffering to stop. Muditā is what that wish becomes when it meets happiness. You want the happiness to continue. And upekkha is the quality that acts as both aid and check on the other three. That last role is important. Ṭhānissaro notes that equanimity corrects the first three brahmavihārās because, as he puts it, their association with joy is gross. Gross here does not mean crude or bad. It means that mettā, karuṇā, and muditā all carry a quality of energetic engagement, a warmth, a forward lean, a responsiveness. This is their strength. It is also their vulnerability. They can become agitated. They can become overwhelming. They can tip from genuine warmth into something feverish. Buddhaghosa, in the Visuddhimagga, the 5th century commentary, makes this point explicit about muditā specifically. One moving from the first three brahmavihārās to equanimity must, he says, see the danger in the first three because their joy has a quality of excitability. Muditā, the one most directly concerned with gladness, the one whose entire function is rejoicing, has an especially pronounced tendency to tip into something too effusive, too grasping, too dependent on conditions. Upekkha corrects this. It stabilizes what muditā generates without extinguishing it. This is why the sequence matters. Muditā cultivates the joy. Upekkha refines it. Without muditā, upekkha has nothing to refine. It becomes cold detachment, the near enemy of equanimity that we examined in that earlier episode. Without upekkha, muditā has no check. It becomes excited grasping, which is precisely the near enemy of muditā that we will examine in the next chapter. They need each other. The sequence builds one on the other. And with muditā, the set is complete. In this catalog, across 4 episodes, we have now examined all 4 brahmavihārās. Goodwill, the wish for beings to be happy. Equanimity, the ground that does not drown in what it meets. Compassion, the warmth that moves toward difficulty. And now, joy, the warmth that moves toward flourishing. These are not 4 separate practices bolted together from different traditions. They are 4 faces of the same orientation, each arising when a trained mind encounters a different condition. When beings suffer, compassion responds. When beings flourish, muditā responds. When the situation exceeds your capacity to change it, equanimity responds. And underneath all 3, mettā, the wish that started everything. But here's what Ṭhānissaro is careful to say, and what matters for the rest of this episode. The Brahmavihārās are at best only the path. They are never the destination. They are what practice looks like as it matures, not what liberation looks like when it arrives. This distinction matters because it keeps the Brahmavihārās honest. They are qualities under development. They can fail. They can be counterfeited. And muditā, as we are about to see, can fail in 2 very different ways that most people never learn to distinguish. A note on sources. Before we examine those failures, a disclosure we have made twice before in this series. If you watch the episodes on equanimity and compassion, you will recognize the pattern. There is a widely taught framework in Buddhism called the near enemies of the Brahmavihārās. Each sublime attitude, the framework says, has a quality that resembles it from the outside but corrupts it from the inside. For mettā, the near enemy is attachment, desire disguised as love. For karuṇā, the near enemy is pity, which subtly elevates the pitier above the pitied. For upekkha, indifference, which looks like equanimity, but is actually a withdrawal of care. For muditā, and this is the one we need for the next chapter, the near enemy is worldly gladness, the effusive, excited happiness at another's good fortune, that is secretly grasping at a pleasant feeling, and that collapses the moment conditions change. It looks like mudita from outside. It is not mudita. The difference only becomes visible when the conditions shift, when the person whose success you were celebrating begins to succeed at something that competes with you. This framework, near enemies and far enemies for each Brahmavihārā, comes from Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, chapter 9, 5th century of the Common Era, roughly 1,000 years after the Buddha. It is not from the Pali Suttas. It is commentarial. This does not make it wrong. Buddhaghosa was a brilliant systematizer, and the near-enemy framework has been useful for centuries of practitioners. But it means you should know its provenance. The canonical scaffolding that Buddhaghosa builds on is in MN 137, where the Buddha himself distinguishes two kinds of gladness. Household-based gladness, gehasita-somanassa, the happiness that arises when desired, things are obtained, or when pleasant experiences from the past are recalled. And renunciation-based gladness, nekkamasita-somanassa, the happiness that arises from seeing clearly, from recognizing the inconstancy of pleasant things and finding peace in that recognition rather than loss. The instruction in MN 137 is explicit. Depending on and relying on renunciation-based happiness, abandon and transcend household-based happiness. MN 137. Buddhaghosa takes this canonical distinction. Two kinds of gladness, one dependent on getting what you want, the other grounded in seeing clearly, and builds his near-enemy table on it. He cites this very passage from MN 137 directly. The table is his. The underlying distinction that there are two structurally different kinds of gladness, one that grasps and one that sees, is the Buddha's own. Both are useful. They are not the same kind of authority. And in the next chapter, we will use both Buddhaghosa's precise diagnostic language and the canon's foundational distinction to examine exactly how mudita fails and why the near enemy is harder to detect than the far. Chapter 2. How Joy Fails. There are two ways mudita fails. Most people only recognize one of them. The first is obvious. It is the one you already know. When someone you envy succeeds, something contracts, a tightening in the chest, a slight turning away, a thought that arrives uninvited. Why them and not me? This is arati. In Pali, the word covers a range: jealousy, resentment, boredom, discontent. Buddhaghosa calls it the far enemy of mudita. Far, because it looks nothing like mudita. It is the overt opposite. You see someone flourish and you feel diminished. There is no confusion here. No one mistakes arati for joy. You know what it is when it arrives. You may not like it. You may try to suppress it, but you recognize it. The second failure is more interesting and far more dangerous, precisely because it does not feel like failure at all. Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga gives us the diagnostic language. Chapter 9, verse 95, his analysis of mudita's entire structure. In Nyanamoli's translation, gladness is characterized as gladdening, produced by others' success. Its function resides in being unenvious. It is manifested as the elimination of aversion. Its proximate cause is seeing being success. It succeeds when it makes aversion subside, and it fails when it produces merriment. That last line, read it again. It fails when it produces merriment, not when it produces resentment. That is the far enemy, the obvious one. Muditā fails when it produces merriment. Pahasa in Pali, boisterous gladness, excited celebration, effusive joy. The kind of happiness that makes you want to high-five someone, throw a party, post about it on social media. The kind that feels wonderful. The kind that looks, from every external angle, exactly like appreciative joy. But it is not muditā. It is the near enemy. Buddhaghosa is precise about why. Verse 100 of the same chapter. Gladness has joy based on the home life as its near enemy, since both share in seeing success. Since both share in seeing success. That is the problem. The near enemy is not a different response to a different stimulus. It is a different response to the same stimulus. Someone succeeds. You feel glad. The question is, what exactly are you glad about? If the gladness is directed at the success itself, at the well-being of the other person, wanting it to continue regardless of how it affects you, that is muditā. If the gladness is directed at the pleasant feeling the success produces in you, the warm glow, the social bonding, the sense of being generous, that is gehasita-somanassa, household-based gladness, the near enemy. From outside, they look identical. Two people at the same celebration, both smiling, both saying congratulations, both apparently delighted. One of them is practicing muditā. The other is feeding on a pleasant feeling. You cannot tell the difference by watching. The difference only reveals itself when conditions change. Here is the test. The colleague whose promotion you celebrated, suppose they are now promoted above you. Suppose their success directly limits yours. Suppose what was an abstract piece of good news becomes a concrete change in your circumstances. If the gladness was muditā, it does not collapse. You wished for their well-being. Their well-being has continued. The quality holds. If the gladness was the near enemy, joy based on the home life, feeding on the pleasant feeling, it collapses because the pleasant feeling is gone. What remains is either nothing or, worse, the far enemy arriving to take its place. The resentment that was there all along, masked by the glow of borrowed warmth. This is why Buddhaghosa calls the near enemy more dangerous than the far. The far enemy is honest. It announces itself. Arati, jealousy, resentment, discontent, feels bad. You know you have a problem. You can work with it. The near enemy feels good. It feels like progress. It feels like you have already developed muditā. And that false sense of accomplishment is precisely what prevents the real development from happening. The canon's own scaffolding for this distinction, as we noted at the end of the last chapter, is in MN 137. The Buddha distinguishes two kinds of gladness: household-based gladness. The happiness that arises when one regards as an acquisition the acquisition of forms cognizable by the eye that are agreeable, pleasing, charming, endearing, connected with worldly baits, or recalls those formerly obtained that are past, ceased, and changed. Renunciation-based gladness, the happiness that arises when, experiencing the inconstancy of those very forms, their change, fading, and cessation, one sees with right discernment, as it has come to be, that all forms, both before and now, are inconstant, stressful, subject to change. Mekkā 137. Two kinds of gladness. One depends on conditions being favorable. The other arises from seeing clearly, from understanding that conditions are inconstant, and finding a different kind of peace in that understanding. The instruction is unambiguous. By depending and relying on the 6 kinds of renunciation-based happiness, abandon and transcend the 6 kinds of household-based happiness. MN 137. Buddhaghosa builds his near-enemy framework on this canonical distinction. He cites this passage directly, but he adds something the canon does not explicitly state. The label near enemy and the warning that the resemblance between the two is itself the danger. The canon gives you the 2 categories. Buddhaghosa tells you that one will masquerade as the other. Between these 2 failures, arati on one side, gehasita-somanassa on the other, mudita occupies a narrow space. It is stable. It is unenvious. It is directed not at the pleasant feeling of observing success, but at the success itself, wanting it to continue, whether or not that continuation feels comfortable to observe. It does not grasp at the warmth. It does not collapse when the warmth disappears. It does not require the other person's success to be non-threatening. It simply meets well-being and responds, "May this continue." The anatomy of envy. There is a piece of science that illuminates, not proves, illuminates, why the far enemy is so reflexive and why the practice of mudita is working against something deeply wired. In 2009, a team of researchers at the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Japan, Takahashi, Kato, Matsuura, and colleagues, published a study in the journal Science on Envy, and what the researchers called Schadenfreude. The pleasure some people feel when someone they resent suffers misfortune. The experiment was small, 19 adult volunteers, so hold the findings lightly, but the structure is worth understanding. Subjects were presented with scenarios involving a self-relevant rival, someone whose success was in a domain the subject cared about personally. When the rival succeeded, subjects showed activation in the anterior cingulate cortex, a brain region associated with social pain, the same region that lights up when you experience rejection or exclusion. The rival's success registered neurologically as pain, not metaphorical pain. Activation in a pain processing region. Then came the second part. When that same rival later suffered a misfortune, the subjects who had shown the strongest pain response to the rival's success now showed the strongest activation in the ventral striatum, the brain's reward circuit. The pleasure at the rival's failure was predicted by the pain at the rival's success. The 2 brain events were correlated across subjects. The more it hurt when they won, the better it felt when they lost. Now, what this study does and does not show, it does not prove anything about mudita. It does not validate Buddhist practice through neuroscience. It does not generalize to all human brains. 19 subjects in Japan is a starting point, not a conclusion. What it does is document, with a precision Buddhaghosa did not have access to, the neural architecture of the obstacle. The movement from another's success to your pain, and from another's failure to your relief. The movement the Visuddhimagga calls arati in one direction, and that we might recognize as Schadenfreude in the other, has an anatomical signature. The anterior cingulate and the ventral striatum are talking to each other. The pain and the pleasure are linked. Neuroscience did not discover mudita. It documented the obstacle. What Buddhaghosa identified as arati, the far enemy, the resentment at another's success, and its shadow, the satisfaction when that person stumbles, has a signature in the brain. Mudita is the deliberate cultivation of a different movement, not suppressing the ACC response through willpower, not pretending the contraction does not happen, training something genuinely different, the stability that does not require another's misfortune to feel relief, the capacity to meet a rival's success and respond, not from the pain circuit, not from the reward circuit activated by their failure, but from something that wants the success to continue. That is what the practice is working against. And that is why teachers in the Theravada tradition, Nyanaponika Thera among them, have observed that mudita may be the most difficult of the 4 Brahmavihārās to extend to difficult persons. Not because the instruction is complicated. The instruction is simple. Pervade the cosmos with appreciative joy. But because the wiring runs deep, and the near enemy, the pleasant-feeling version that collapses under pressure, offers a convincing counterfeit that lets you believe you have already arrived. In the next chapter, we will look at what the practice actually looks like. Not the formula, you have the formula. The question now is, what do you do when you are sitting with the contraction? When the colleague's success has arrived, and the first half second has already happened, and what you feel is not abundant, not expansive, not immeasurable. What then? Chapter 3, the practice. What then? Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu addresses the difficult case directly. Not with a theory, not with a formula. With a scenario most people over 50 will recognize. Suppose that your neighbor is wealthier than you are. You may resist feeling empathetic joy for him because you think, he's already well off while I'm still struggling. Why should I wish him to be even happier than he is? If you find yourself thinking in those terms, remind yourself that you don't know what your karmic seeds are. You don't know what his karmic seeds are. Maybe his good karmic seeds are about to die. Do you want them to die any faster? Does his happiness diminish yours? What kind of attitude is that? Stay with the question. Does his happiness diminish yours? Not, should his happiness diminish yours? Not, is it rational for his happiness to diminish yours? Does it? What is your actual experience in the moment when someone who has more than you receives more still? What happens in the body? In the quality of your attention? In the slight, almost imperceptible shift in how you see them? Ṭhānissaro does not stop there. He adds a second angle, one that works not through compassion, but through enlightened self-interest. If you're resentful of somebody else's happiness, someday when you get happy, there's going to be somebody resentful of yours. Do you want that? Notice what he is doing. He is not asking you to pretend the resentment is not there. He is not telling you to feel something you do not feel. He is asking you to examine the assumption behind the resentment. The assumption that well-being is a finite resource, that another's portion reduces yours, that the cosmos of happiness operates on a scarcity model. And he is asking, is that assumption true? And even if you answer no intellectually, what does your actual moment-to-moment experience say? Because the intellectual answer and the felt experience are often very different things. You can believe that another's happiness does not diminish yours and still feel the contraction when it arrives. This is the honest starting point. Not, I should feel mudita, but I notice that I do not. The quiet comparisons. There is something that happens in the middle and later portions of a life that changes the texture of comparison. When you are young, the categories are relatively clean. Happy for friends, envious of rivals, inspired by heroes. The lines are legible. Later, they blur. The colleague who receives the recognition you worked for, but who also happens to be someone you trained. The peer whose career accelerated while yours plateaued, but whose acceleration you know came partly from sacrifices you would not have been willing to make. the child who surpasses what you built, and the pride and the sting arrive in the same breath. The friend who seems to age more gracefully, achieve more effortlessly, be recognized more readily, and the affection you feel for them does not eliminate the contraction. It coexists with it. The resentment that arrives in these moments is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet, a slight contraction, a small diminishment, a momentary wish, barely conscious that it were otherwise. Not that they had failed, just that the gap between their situation and yours were a little smaller, a little less visible, a little less personal. This is where the practice lives, not in the dramatic case, not in the enemy's triumph, in the quiet, half-acknowledged moments of comparison that happen between people who are not enemies at all. The canon does not give us a saw-simile equivalent for muditā. There is no story in the suttas where the Buddha tests appreciative joy against an enemy's success, the way MN 21 tests mettā against physical violence. The famous instruction to maintain goodwill, even if bandits were to saw you limb from limb, MN 21. For mettā, the canon provides the most extreme test case imaginable. For muditā, it provides the formula: abundant, expansive, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will. And the formula is directed at the cosmos, not at a curated list of people whose success feels safe. Buddhaghosa's commentary prescribes a graduated extension. Start with someone dear, someone whose success is easy to welcome, and develop the quality there before extending it to neutral persons, then to difficult persons. This graduated sequence is Buddhaghosa's systematization in the Visuddhimagga, not a canonical episode, but it is honest as a prescription. You do not start where it is hardest. You start where the quality can actually arise, and you develop it until it has enough stability to meet harder conditions without collapsing. The movements of practice. The practice Ṭhānissaro describes is more precise than simply feeling happy for people, whether or not you feel happy for them. It has several movements. First, notice when the quality is not there, the slight contraction, the wish that things were otherwise, the momentary turning away. Name it, not to shame yourself, but because naming clearly is how the practice begins. You cannot work with what you have not acknowledged. And the near enemy thrives precisely in the space where you have not looked carefully enough to see that what you are feeling is not muditā, but its counterfeit. Second, examine the assumption. Does their happiness diminish yours? Ṭhānissaro's question is not rhetorical. It is an investigation. Sit with it, not the intellectual answer, the felt answer. What happens in your experience when you genuinely investigate whether another's well-being reduces your own? In most cases, when you look carefully, the assumption dissolves. Not because you have argued it away, because when you look at the actual experience rather than the story about the experience, the scarcity model does not hold. Their happiness is not subtracting from a fixed pool. The contraction was real, but the assumption behind it was not. Third, remember that you do not know the full picture. You do not know what karmic seeds will bear what fruit, in whose life, at what time. This is not fatalism. It is honesty about the limits of your knowledge. The person whose success looks effortless from outside may be carrying difficulties you cannot see. The person whose recognition seems unearned may have paid costs you are not aware of. And even if neither of those is true, even if their success is exactly as undeserved as it appears, does resenting it help you? Does it change their situation? Does it change yours? What kind of attitude is that? Fourth, and this is the movement most people miss, Extend mudita not only to outcomes but to skillful actions themselves. Ṭhānissaro, in a meditation talk from 2013, mudita is an attitude you extend not only to the results of skillful actions, which is what the happiness is, but also to the skillful actions themselves. This shifts the entire frame. You are not asked to rejoice only when someone succeeds. You are asked to rejoice when someone acts skillfully, with care, with integrity, with effort, regardless of the outcome, and regardless of whether their skillful action produces results that compete with yours. When a colleague works carefully, when a rival prepares thoroughly, when someone younger brings an energy and precision you recognize as genuine, the action itself is worth appreciating, not because it benefits you, because skillful action, wherever it occurs and whoever performs it, is worth wanting to continue. This is where mudita stops being a warm feeling and becomes something more structural. It is a reorientation of what you value. If you value only outcomes, success, recognition, reward, then another's outcomes are always potentially threatening. If you value skillful action itself, the effort, the integrity, the care, then another's skillful action is not a rival. It is something the mind can genuinely welcome. And then, apamana, immeasurable. The canonical formula does not stop at the easy case. It does not stop at the difficult case. It says, the all-encompassing cosmos, every direction, without boundary. The practice, when it matures, is not a selective generosity, mudita for the lovable, tolerance for the rest. It is a quality that has been developed until it has no boundary. It does not depend on identifying the person. It does not depend on liking them. It does not depend on their success feeling non-threatening. It meets well-being, anywhere, in any being, and the response is the same. May this continue. Not because it is easy, not because it feels good, because the mind has been trained until the response is stable, and the stability does not require favorable conditions to hold. That is the target. Most of us are not there. The practice is what happens between where you are and where the formula points. Chapter 4. The Fourth Face. The question Ṭhānissaro keeps returning to, does his happiness diminish yours, is not, in the end, a question about emotion. It is a question about something more fundamental. It is a question about what you believe, or more precisely, what you see, about the nature of well-being itself. If you see well-being as scarce, then another's success is a threat, not always consciously, not always dramatically, but structurally, at the level of assumption that shapes how you respond before you have time to choose a response. The contraction happens, the slight diminishment happens, the wish it were otherwise happens. Because somewhere beneath the story you tell yourself about being a generous person, there is an operating model that says, there is only so much to go around. And they just took some. Mudita is grounded in a different seeing, not a belief you adopt, not a positive affirmation you repeat, a seeing, something that arises when you look carefully at the actual structure of well-being and notice that it does not work the way the contraction assumes. Your neighbor's wealth does not subtract from your capacity for peace. Your colleague's recognition does not reduce your ability to do meaningful work. Your friend's health does not diminish your own. These are not competing claims on a single resource. The cosmos in which beings can be happy is not a zero-sum game. The canonical formula says, without hostility. And the opposite of hostility is not indifference. It is not the withdrawal that says, I will simply not care about what happens to them. The opposite of hostility is genuine care that does not require protection. Care that can meet another's flourishing without needing to defend against it. Care that says, your well-being is not my loss. This is what the formula points toward when it says immeasurable. Not immeasurable as a poetic exaggeration. Immeasurable as a structural description. The quality, when fully developed, has no measure, no boundary where it stops, no threshold past which it becomes conditional, no point at which it says, this much muditā, but no further, the cosmos, all beings, in its entirety. Most of us practice somewhere far short of that, and that is fine. The formula is a direction, not a standard you have already failed to meet. The practice is what happens between the contraction and the formula, in that space where you notice, examine, and choose to train a different response. Not once, not as a breakthrough, as a repeated, patient, undramatic discipline that builds the quality over time, the way any serious training builds capacity, gradually, with setbacks, without the expectation that arrival is imminent. The Brahmavihārās end here, in this catalog, with this quality, 4 episodes, 4 faces of the same orientation. Goodwill, the wish for beings to be happy. Compassion, the response when they suffer. Equanimity, the ground that does not drown in what it meets. And muditā, the delight when they flourish. They are not 4 separate techniques assembled from different sources. They are one orientation, the orientation of a mind in training, expressing itself differently depending on what it encounters. Suffering arrives, compassion, happiness arrives, muditā. Complexity beyond your capacity to change, equanimity, and underneath all 3, generating all 3, the foundational wish, may beings be happy, mettā, the root from which the other 3 grow. Notice something about the set. Each Brahmavihārā, in its own way, is a practice of not contracting. Mettā does not contract into preference. It extends the wish to all beings, not only the ones you like. Karuṇā does not contract into overwhelm. It stays present with suffering without drowning. Upekkha does not contract into indifference. It holds steady without withdrawing care. And muditā does not contract into resentment or grasping. It meets another's flourishing without needing to protect against it or feed on it. 4 practices of non-contraction. 4 ways the mind learns to stay open when its habit is to close. That is what the Brahmavihārās are training. Not 4 feelings. 4 capacities for openness, each tested by a different condition, each developed through a different discipline, each capable of failing in its own characteristic way. And Ṭhānissaro is careful, as always, to keep the Brahmavihārās in their proper place. They are at best only the path. They are never the destination. They are what practice looks like as it matures. They are not what liberation looks like when it arrives. The Brahmavihārās cultivate qualities of a mind in training: warmth, stability, openness, delight. They do not by themselves end suffering. They prepare the ground. They develop the qualities that make deeper practice possible. They are, in the language of the path, supports, not the path's end. This distinction matters because it keeps the practice honest. If you mistake the Brahmavihārās for the goal, you risk a kind of spiritual bypassing, cultivating warmth while avoiding the harder work of seeing clearly into the nature of experience itself. The Brahmavihārās are beautiful. They are also incomplete. They are the qualities of a heart in training. What completes the training is wisdom, paññā, the direct seeing into impermanence, suffering, and not self that the Brahmavihārās, at their best, make possible by softening the mind enough to look without flinching. But that is a different teaching. For now, for this episode, what matters is this: Muditā is real. It is trainable. It is not a personality trait you either have or lack. It is a capacity that can be developed through the same patient, repeated, undramatic discipline that develops any other quality worth having. And the development begins not with the easy case, the loved one's success that warms you, but with the honest acknowledgement that the difficult case exists, that the contraction is real, that the near enemy is convincing, and that the formula points somewhere worth going, even if you have not arrived. Does his happiness diminish yours? Sit with that. What this trained mind is, what consciousness itself is, that it can be developed, that it can be trained, and in the canon's most arresting phrase, that it can become unestablished, is the question the next episode begins. We have been asking, across these Brahmavihārā episodes, what does a trained mind do? How does it respond to suffering, to happiness, to complexity, to flourishing? Next, what is mind that it can be trained at all? What is consciousness that it can be shaped by practice? And what happens when it is no longer shaped by anything? Episode 9 of The Meeting Point, The Question.